David sat at the dining table, swirling his spoon absent-mindedly in his bowl of cereal. Across from him, his mother, Esther, sorted through a basket of fresh vegetables, her mind already occupied with the day's cooking. David cleared his throat, choosing his words carefully. "Mama, can you buy some live fresh fish for me?" he asked, trying to keep his voice casual. Esther glanced at him, one brow raised. "Live fish? What for?" David forced a small chuckle. "For school. Our teacher said we should bring live fish for our practical class in biology." His mother pursed her lips, studying him. "Why live fish? Wouldn't dead ones work just fine?" "No, Mama," he insisted. "They said we need to observe their movements before the dissection." The thought of dissection made his stomach turn. The idea of anyone harming a fish, cutting it open, sent a shiver through him. He wasn't bringing the fish to school. He just wanted to have them, to caress them, to smash them. Esther sighed. "All right, I'll buy some when I go to the market." David beamed. "Big ones, Mama." "Thank you, Mama." That evening, Esther returned from the market with a plastic bag filled with water. Inside, 2 tilapias wriggled, their silver scales catching the kitchen light. David's heart thudded as he took the bag from her, his fingers tingling from the slight chill of the water. "I'll keep them safe until tomorrow," he said, turning toward his room before his mother could ask further questions. Once inside, he carefully poured the fish into a large glass bowl he had prepared earlier. He looked at them as his down below began to rise. "You're so beautiful," he whispered, his voice barely audible. He dipped his fingers into the water, and one of the fish brushed against him, sending a soft thrill up his arm. A small, dreamy smile tugged at his lips. For hours, he did unthinkable things to them, one after the other. At school, when his friends talked about movies or football, he stayed quiet, his thoughts drifting back to his secret world. At night, he dreamed of swimming alongside them, weightless, their soft bodies brushing against his own. David's fascination deepened. Every evening, he locked himself in his room, touching the fish and stroking the water gently to caress them. He studied the way their gills fluttered, the hypnotic way their tails cut through the water. But after each episode he would feel guilty and dirty, yet he could not stop. Not far from David's house, their neighbor, Mr. Ease, had a large fish pond filled with fat, glistening catfishes. The pond, covered by a simple wire fence, sat at the back of the compound, out of sight from the main house. David had discovered it one evening while wandering, and it became his new secret escape. Almost every night he snuck out, slipping past the sleeping household, creeping through the shadows and kneeling by the pond. He would dip his hands into the cool water, feeling the fishes brush against his fingers, pull out one and do unspeakable things to the fish. Sometimes he whispered to them, feeling an almost electric connection between them. Mr. Ease and his family occasionally heard splashing sounds at night, but dismissed them as the fish stirring in the water. But one night, something changed. As David crouched by the pond, he pulled down his trousers. He carefully reached in, attempting to cradle a catfish in his hands. The slippery creature wriggled furiously, sending a loud splash into the still night air. A nearby bucket tipped over, crashing against the wooden planks lining the pond. The sound echoed through the compound. David, however, was too engrossed to notice anything beyond the fish he was smashing. His breathing slowed, his mind dissolving into the sensation of the cool, smooth scales pressing against his palms. He gazed into the fish's unblinking eyes, lost in its silent world. Behind him, Mr. Ease approached quietly, his flashlight turned off. He had grown suspicious of the nightly disturbances and had decided to investigate. Stepping carefully over the damp ground, he reached David's side before the boy even sensed his presence. Then in one swift motion, Mr. Ease flicked on the flashlight. "David!" His voice thundered through the night. David jolted, his hands slipping. The fish flopped back into the water with a loud splash. His heart pounded as he turned, his wide eyes meeting Mr. Ease's furious glare. "What in God's name are you doing?" David had no words. He stood frozen, caught in the act, his wet hands trembling at his sides. How did it all begin? How can a young boy of 17 years be attracted to fish? Hello, friends. Before we continue this chilling tale, kindly subscribe to this channel. Like this video and share it with your friends. Turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our thrilling stories. God bless you. To understand David's strange fate, we must go back to where it all started. Once upon a time in a small town in Africa, there lived a woman named Esther. She was married to Chief James, who was a successful and busy man. The couple were both hardworking and rich with 4 children, 3 daughters and their only son David. To Esther, David was a gift from God, the one who would carry on the family name. She loved all her children, but everyone could see that David was her favorite. David grew up knowing that he was special. If he wanted something, he got it. His mother believed that he should not do any house chores. Only his sisters did all the house chores. If he misbehaved, his mother always had an excuse for him. "He's just a boy," she would say. "Boys are different from girls." One afternoon, Esther came home from the market and found her daughters arguing in the living room. Nging, the eldest, stood with her arms crossed, her face red with anger. "Mama, David took my money again. I kept it in my bag and now it's gone," she said. Esther sighed and waved her hand dismissively. "Why are you shouting? He is your brother. Maybe he needed it for something important." "That's not fair, Mama," Joy, the youngest, added. "He always does this, and you never correct him." David, sitting lazily on the couch, smirked. "Why are you making noise over small money?" he said, flipping through his phone. "You girls always like to complain." Nging clenched her fists. "It's not just the money, Mama. David does whatever he likes. If I did the same thing, you would punish me." Esther frowned but did not respond. Deep down, she knew they were right, but she couldn't bring herself to scold David. Instead, she sighed and muttered, "You girls should learn to respect your brother." As she walked to the kitchen, Nging and Joy exchanged a frustrated look. They knew this wasn't the last time David would get away with something. One warm Saturday afternoon, Esther sat outside with 3 of her closest friends, Mrs. Agnes, Mrs. Florence, and Mrs. Bessie. The women had gathered under the mango tree in front of Esther's house, fanning themselves as they talked about family, children, and marriage. "You see," Mrs. Agnes said, adjusting her wrapper, "a woman without a male child in this country is not respected. No matter how many daughters you have, if there is no son, people will look at you like you're incomplete." Mrs. Florence nodded in agreement. "Exactly. Some men will even marry a second wife just to have a boy. Look at my neighbor, Madame Chinway. 5 girls and not a single boy. Her husband barely talks to her anymore." Esther smiled proudly, adjusting the scarf on her head. "That is why I do not joke with my David. He is my only son, and I make sure he knows it. Anything he wants, I give him. My daughters will be fine, but David, he is my crown." Mrs. Bessie clicked her tongue. "God forbid. I have 3 beautiful daughters and I am proud of them. Boy or not boy, the most important thing is to train them properly." Soon the women began arguing, and Mrs. Bessie angrily went home. Esther beamed with pride, not knowing that her blind love for David was shaping him into someone the world would not tolerate. David strutted through the school hallways like he owned the place. He never carried his books, and when teachers asked questions in class, he either ignored them or gave a rude reply. "David, why didn't you submit your assignment?" Mr. Johnson, the mathematics teacher, asked one morning. David leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "Sir, do I look like I have time for your useless assignments?" The class went silent. Some students gasped, others whispered. Mr. Johnson's face hardened. "Come to my office after school." David scoffed. "I'm not coming, and if you try anything, I'll tell my mother." Mr. Johnson sighed. It wasn't the first time David had disrespected him, or any teacher for that matter. The boy was untouchable. He bullied younger students and took their lunch money, and anyone who dared to challenge him regretted it. His parents were rich, so whenever he failed, his mother would settle the teachers. If a teacher refused, she would storm the school, demanding to know why her innocent son was being targeted. One day, David was bullying Angela again. He shoved her against a wall, mocking her as she struggled. But this time, he went too far. He touched her in a way that made her feel deeply uncomfortable. Angela froze, her body stiff with fear. Tears welled up in her eyes as she pushed him away with all her strength and ran. David and his friends burst into laughter, mocking her as she disappeared down the hallway. That evening, Angela came home in tears. Her mother, Mrs. Mary, was in the kitchen preparing dinner when she heard the front door slam. She turned to see her daughter standing there sobbing. "Angela, what is it?" she asked, rushing to her side. Angela wiped her face, but the tears wouldn't stop. "It's David," she said in a trembling voice. He touched me, Mama." Mrs. Mary's face darkened. Her eyes, usually warm, turned cold. "What did you say?" Angela sniffed. "He always bullies me, but today was different. He, he touched me in a bad way." A storm brewed in Mrs. Mary's heart. No one, no one dared to hurt her child. She took a deep breath, trying to control her rising anger. "We are going to that school tomorrow," she said firmly. "This nonsense must stop." The next morning, Mrs. Mary marched into the school with Angela by her side. She demanded to see the principal. Inside his office, the principal, a middle-aged man with a round belly, listened as Mrs. Mary explained what David had done. But instead of showing concern, he sighed and leaned back in his chair. "You see, madam," he said lazily, "David is a special student. His parents are very important people. I don't think he meant any harm." Mrs. Mary's hands clenched into fists. "Are you saying my daughter is lying?" The principal forced a smile. "Not at all, madam, but boys will be boys. I suggest we just let this go. I'm sure Angela will be fine." Angela lowered her head. She had known this would happen. No one ever stood up to David. Mrs. Mary, however, was not a woman to be ignored. She turned to David, who was sitting in a chair with a smug smile on his face. He looked at her and laughed. "See you around, Angela," he said mockingly. "Maybe next time, you won't be such a crybaby." That was the last straw. Mrs. Mary stood up slowly, her eyes cold and unreadable. "You may be protected in this school, David," she said in a quiet, dangerous voice. "But outside these walls, we shall see." David just smirked, thinking nothing of her words. But he had no idea who he was dealing with. After school, David's black SUV was waiting at the gate as usual. He climbed inside, scrolling through his phone, not noticing Mrs. Mary watching from a distance. She whispered something under her breath, her fingers twitching slightly. Inside the car, the driver, Mr. Emmanuel, suddenly felt a strange fog settle over his mind. His hands gripped the wheel tightly, his eyes unfocused. Without a word, he started the car and drove. David barely looked up until he realized they had missed the turn leading home. "Olga, where you they go?" he asked. The driver didn't respond. David sat up straight, panic creeping into his voice. "Are you deaf? I say stop the car." Silence. The road stretched on, leading them away from the city into an unfamiliar, lonely area. The trees stood tall, their branches swaying eerily in the wind. David's heartbeat quickened. Something was wrong. The car finally stopped in the middle of an open field. Without thinking, David yanked the door open and jumped out. He turned to run. But she was already there. Mrs. Mary stood a few feet away, her body no longer human. Her skin had turned gray, her eyes glowed red, and her fingers had become long and clawed. A dark aura surrounded her, twisting like smoke. David's breath caught in his throat. What are you?" She took a step closer. "Did you think you could harm my daughter and walk free?" David stumbled backwards. "I swear I didn't do anything." She smiled, revealing sharp teeth. "Lies!" Before he could react, she lunged at him, grabbing his face with an iron grip. He struggled, but her strength was unnatural. He gasped as she opened her mouth and bit into his neck. Pain exploded in his body. A strange burning sensation spread through his veins. He screamed, falling to his knees as his vision blurred. His heartbeat thundered in his ears. His skin felt hot, too hot, then suddenly cold. Something was happening to him. Mrs. Mary whispered in an ancient language, her voice echoing like 1,000 whispers in his mind. "From this day forward, you shall no longer desire what men desire. Your heart, your soul, your body will crave the cold, the wet, the creatures of the deep." David's body convulsed. His fingers twitched. His mind spun, drowning in confusion. Then darkness. When David woke up, he was in his bed. His mother was sitting beside him, worry etched on her face. "David, my son, what happened to you?" she asked. His throat was dry. His body felt strange, heavy, but at the same time, drawn to something. Then he saw it. A glass bowl sat on his bedside table. Inside, a single goldfish swam lazily. David stared at it. His heart pounded. A strange, deep yearning filled his chest. He reached out and smiled. From that day, David was never normal again. Then came the night in Mr. Ease's compound. Mr. Ease's voice tore through the night like thunder. "Come and see. Abomination. This boy is not normal." His alarmed cries echoed through the quiet neighborhood, drawing curious and concerned neighbors from their homes. David's parents, Chief and Esther, arrived moments later, their faces filled with confusion and embarrassment. When they saw their son, drenched in water, crouched at the edge of the fish pond with trembling hands and wild, obsessed eyes, shame burned through them like fire. Esther gasped, covering her mouth. "David, what are you doing?" David stood slowly, his body weak, his clothes soaked. The flashlight beams from the neighbors revealed his haunted face, his dilated pupils, and the strange, distant look in his eyes. He didn't even know how to explain. His father, Chief, seized him by the collar, shaking him roughly. "Have you lost your mind?" David dropped his gaze, shame washing over him in waves. Tears stung his eyes as he whispered, "I can't stop, Papa. I can't stop myself." His words sent shivers down his parents' spines. "Take him home," Mr. Ease muttered, shaking his head in disgust. "This is no ordinary sickness." That night, David sat in the living room, surrounded by his parents and sisters. The weight of everything crashed down on him, and for the first time he broke. He wept. He told them everything. However, ever since his encounter with Mrs. Mary, something had changed in him. How the urge to touch fish, to be close to them, to hold them, had become stronger than hunger itself. He admitted he had sneaked into ponds, lakes, and even fish markets just to feel the cold, slippery scales against his fingers. "I tried to fight it," he sobbed, "but I couldn't. It's like something is inside me, controlling me." His father sat in stunned silence. His mother, Esther, looked horrified. "She did something to me," David whispered, his voice trembling. "Mrs. Mary, she's the only one who could have done this." Esther's face twisted in anger. "That witch! She cursed my son." David wiped his tears and looked at his mother, his voice shaking but firm. "Mama, this is your fault too." Esther froze. "What?" "You spoiled me," David continued, his voice rising. "You let me do whatever I wanted. You never corrected me. You never taught me right from wrong. You let me become this person who could hurt Angela and laugh about it." His words stung, and Esther's face crumbled. Chief clenched his fists. "This is not the time for blame. We must find a cure for you, son." David's parents tried everything. Doctors ran tests, but they found nothing wrong with him. Pastors prayed, laying hands on him, but David still felt the pull toward water. Traditional healers gave him herbs, but the obsession remained. His family grew desperate. One evening, Chief brought in a renowned pastor, a man with deep, knowing eyes and a voice like the wind. The pastor placed a bowl of water in front of David and prayed. Slowly, an image appeared on the water's surface. Mrs. Mary's face, her eyes glowing with quiet power. "It is her," the pastor confirmed. "She laid the curse, and David will die on his 18th birthday, if not broken." Without hesitation, David's parents stormed Mrs. Mary's house. They pounded on her door, demanding she undo whatever she had done to their son. Mrs. Mary stepped outside, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. "You let your son become a monster," she said simply. "Now he belongs to the creatures of the deep." Esther's voice cracked. "Please, we are begging you, undo this. He is only a child." Mrs. Mary's gaze was cold. "He stopped being a child the day he decided to hurt my daughter." Chief clenched his fists. "How do we stop this?" "What do you want?" Mrs. Mary let out a long sigh before finally speaking. "There is only one way," she said. "A sacrifice must be made." David's breath caught in his throat. "Sacrifice?" Mrs. Mary nodded. Someone related by blood must give up their eyes to the river goddess. Only then will the fishes release him. A heavy silence fell over them. David turned to his mother, his eyes pleading. She had always said she would do anything for him. Surely she would do this too. But Esther took a step back, shaking her head. No, no, I can't. David's heart sank. Mama? I love you, David, Esther whispered, her voice trembling. But I can't give up my eyes. I can't live in darkness. Shock and betrayal crashed over David like a wave. He had always believed his mother would do anything for him. But now when he truly needed her, she refused. Anger boiled in his chest. So you would rather let me die? Esther opened her mouth, but no words came. Suddenly, his sisters, Nging, Ada, and Abeli, stepped forward. We will do it, Ada said, her voice steady. David's eyes widened. No, I can't let you. We love you, David, Abeli interrupted. We won't let you die. Tears streamed down David's face. I promise you, my beautiful sisters, I will change my evil ways, David said. The next morning they returned to Mrs. Mary, ready for the ritual. But as soon as the sisters knelt before her, ready to sacrifice their sight, Mrs. Mary did something unexpected. She smiled. The curse is broken. Everyone froze. What? Chief gasped. Mrs. Mary turned to David. You have learned your lesson. You know the pain of being powerless, of being an outcast. You have wept, regretted, and changed. She placed a hand on his forehead, and a warm sensation rushed through him. The river goddess does not want your sister's eyes. The curse was never about punishment. It was about understanding. David's breath hitched as he felt something lift from his body. The hunger, the obsession, the unnatural pull toward fish, all of it vanished. He was free. David fell to his knees, sobbing. Thank you. Mrs. Mary looked at him one last time before turning to Angela, who had been watching quietly. It is up to you now, my child, she said softly. Angela hesitated, then nodded. She stepped forward, looking David in the eyes. I forgive you, she said. David's heart clenched. He had spent so long drowning in his shame, but now with her words he finally felt the weight lift. For the first time in months he felt human again. As he walked away from Mrs. Mary's house, the sun rising in the sky, he vowed never to take kindness, respect, or life for granted again. And so, the curse was broken. But at what cost? David, once untouchable and spoiled, had to face the harsh reality of his upbringing. His mother, who once shielded him from consequences, refused to make the ultimate sacrifice. In the end, it was his sisters, the ones who had always been ignored, who were willing to save him. So, friends, what do you think? Did David deserve his punishment? Should his mother have been the one to make the sacrifice? Was Mrs. Mary right in cursing him, or did she go too far? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching.